Hi, everybody. My name is Sierra, and I will be discussing Skinner's book about behaviorism, specifically Chapter 8, Causes and Reasons. So, the first section that he talks about is commands, advice, and warnings. And he defines each of them. He defines a command as the speaker tells the listener what to do and arranges aversive consequences under which he learns to do it again whenever the order is repeated. He uses the example move over to demonstrate a command. And an example that I thought about because I work in an elementary school is one with a bully and one with another student. So the example is a bully enters into the cafeteria and he states, "Give me your ice cream money." The peer may respond by giving the bully the ice cream money due to being pushed multiple times when he did not follow the command. So in this instance, the bully has conditioned the other student to respond in this manner due to the multiple times that he pushed him. Next, he defines warning as differing from an order or a command because the consequences are not arranged by the person and states that it implies a consequence. And in this instance, he uses the example, "Watch out." And lastly, he defines advice as it specifies behavior and implies positively reinforcing consequences which are not arranged by the person who issues it. And he uses the example, "Go west, young man." The next section that he talks about is directions and instructions. He defines directions as one person gives another directions by noting or implying a reinforcing consequence, by describing behavior, that a consequence, especially by describing the controlling environment. So directions are more detailed and they give you a step-by-step direction to obtain the reinforcer. So he gives the example of someone giving directions to Boston. So in order for the listener to make their destination, they would have to follow the directions from the speaker in order to experience or obtain the reinforcing consequence. And in this case, the reinforcer would be making it to the destination. He also gives another example of operating the vending machine as well, and likewise, following the directions for the vending machine would result in a reinforcing consequence, which in this case, the reinforcer would be obtaining the item from the vending machine. He then explains what instruction is, and he defines it as being designed to make further direction unnecessary. So an individual can be told to do something, as the example that he gave was to start, shift, signal, and stop the car, which are directions. So now imagine if the student struggled with shifting the car, the instructor may offer feedback to the individual, which then becomes instruction, or he may step in if the learner is doing something incorrectly, and this would be a form of instruction. The next section, he talks about folklore, maxims, and proverbs, where he describes these forms of instruction as being passed down from generation to generation. And as we know from experience and just watching other people, we know that these typically influence a lot of the behaviors and the attitudes that we have, and these are usually part of personal and cultural beliefs. So one of the maxims that he used as an example was to lose a friend, lend him money. And he breaks it down for us and he tells us that the behavior would be lending the money and the consequence would be losing the friend. The next section, he talks about governmental and religious laws. So Skinner discusses when people began to live together, a social environment arose and was marked by certain practices. So even today, we know that we have governmental and religious laws, and we use these laws as a guideline for acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And Skinner states that by obeying these laws, a person avoids punishment. Therefore, this implies the consequence for following the law would be avoiding punishment. So an example of following a rule or a law is our George Mason University Honor Code. So by obeying the honor code, we avoid punishment such as receiving academic expulsion, and the contingencies of the honor code are powerful because they are strictly enforced. The next section, Skinner talks about the differences in behavior shaped by natural consequences and behaviors generated by a rule. So this is the laws of science, and he gives the example of the blacksmith and the bellows. And he explains that the bellows is more efficient if it is opened fully before closing it and opened quickly. and closed slowly. So the steady fire served as the reinforcer in this situation, and the blacksmith continued this behavior because it was reinforcing to him. So from this, he created a rule in order to describe or remember how to operate the bellow, which helped the apprentice operate it, but it wasn't in the same manner as how the blacksmith's history was with it. So what's important to recognize is that although they were completing the same task, their history with the bellow was completely different, and the apprentice operated the bellow based upon how he was directed to operate it, but the blacksmith experienced reinforcement due to the consequence of the fire being maintained as a result of him opening it fully and closing it slowly. So that's what happened with that. Another statement in this section that I found interesting was that differences in thought processes have been attributed to the apparent differences between laws of religion and the laws of science. So he breaks it down and he says that religion and government are based upon and maintained by social environments, and the laws of science are based upon environmental science. So science is therefore based upon the natural contingencies which can reinforce our behavior. The next section that he talks about is contingency shaped versus rule governed behavior. And Skinner states that rules can be learned more quickly than behavior shaped by contingencies. I find this to be true. Again, another example, because I work in a school. We have SOAR expectations, which are the rules, and the students typically have no issue with learning them, and they usually as a result, they can generalize their behaviors in the school setting, the home, and the community. So the control exerted by the directions, laws, and advice is more conspicuous than those exerted by the contingencies themselves. So we can visibly see if someone is following rules, taking advice, or following directions by the consequences of an individual's behavior. But if we were to solely look at the contingencies, it will become less clear and more complicated to explain. This isn't my question, but something that I thought about while I was reading was the unspoken and unwritten rules, and I was kind of wondering where this would fall into play. So if anybody wants to answer it, you can. So the next section is, are the rules in the contingencies? Skinner states that a person changed by operant reinforcement has not learned probability. He has learned to respond at a given frequency of reinforcement. And I think that this goes back to the example of the blacksmith operating the bellows. As we know, operant condition increases the likelihood that a response will occur. Because he discovered that the bellows worked well under certain conditions, this event reinforced the behavior because the fire was maintained hot and steady, and he was able to discover this event due to it occurring over time. Next, Skinner talks about reason and reasons, and he states that reason is probably one of the most admired cognitive or mental processes is reason. And as we see, Skinner raised a lot of questions about what reason actually is, and this is mostly due to it probably being a form of mentalism, and which we have learned it is to be ascribing a cognitive cause to behavior. Skinner states that reason is the principle and the original force of the mind, which impels to the discovery of truth and defining and assuming it. He makes it clear that we are a long way from a behavior definition of reason. He states that we often think of consequences as reason, and then he states that the consequences described or implied in advice, warnings, and instruction and laws are the reasons why a person takes advice, heeds warnings, and follows instructions, and conditioning is a major factor for this to occur. And in addition to what we have learned, we learned that history plays a major role in how we behave. So for example, I had a track coach in the past who taught me how to do long and triple jump, which I was scared to do. And I was able to place when he actually trained me and I went to the track meets. And then later he asked me to do hurdles, and I felt that I was too short and I really did not want to do it. But then I remembered my experience with him in the past of teaching me how to do long and triple jump, and it was successful. So this was the reason that I was willing to do the hurdles. So next, Skinner talks about two forms of reason, And this is the reasoning section. So he talks about two forms of reason, which are induction and deduction. And he explains that induction is reasoning from part to whole and from particulars to general, and deduction is reasoning from generals to particulars. And he informs us that reasoning is not what ABA is interested in due to it not being able to describe any behavioral processes. So on page 142, Skinner states the consequences described or implied in advice, warnings, instructions, and laws are the reasons why a person takes advice, heeds warning, follows instructions, and obeys laws. People are not born with the readiness to follow advice or heed warnings. Stimuli having the status of advice and warnings must play a part in a long history of conditioning before a person can be induced to behave by being given reasons. So this is on page 142 to 143. So I want to conclude this video by asking, after reading this chapter, what is your understanding of the differences between causes and reason?